Hi, Michelle Glass here, and welcome back to another one of our Chapter 28 lectures. Our topic for this presentation is the uterine cycle. So let's get started. We need to take a few minutes and review the anatomy of the uterus. We just basically named it in earlier videos, so now we need to look at some of the parts. So you have the kind of broad top of the uterus, which is called the fundus, and then you have the body, and then of course at the base there you have the cervix, which opens up to the vagina. So you have the opening that's not labeled there called the external os. You have three distinctive layers forming the uterus. So you have the perimetrium on the outermost layer. You have a myometrium, which is a really thick, smooth, muscular layer. The contractions of the myometria will be, of course, important in expelling the fetus during labor and delivery, and then also helping to remove the material at menses. And then you have an innermost lining, which is called the endometrium, and this is glandular and lots of vascularization. And of course, this tissue is there to help support the developing fetus. The endometrium is the layer that changes during the uterine cycle. So that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit more closely next. Okay, so we have our perimetrium on the outside, our big layer of smooth muscle called the myometrium, and then we have our endometrium, which is the innermost layer. Notice that you have what are called spiral arteries extending into that endometrial layer, and then I've drawn in a few uterine glands there. Of course, it's very, lots of glands are present, and I've just drawn in a few to indicate that. Notice that you have just one little portion that's actually considered the functional zone. So when we are talking about the uterine cycle and the changes that happen in the endometrium, it's not that entire layer, it's just that functional zone. The uterine cycle varies female to female, and sometimes it can vary cycle to cycle. It's usually lasting for about 21 to 35 days. Of course, this should kind of correlate to the 28-day ovarian cycle, and so we will see that in some cases it does match up in that same way. The uterine cycle are, of course, changes to the endometrium that are happening every 28 days or so. And in females, this starts around age 11 or 12, and that initial menses is called menarche. And then it has an end point. So we do see that in females, there is a very set reproductive window. The menopause is described as the last menses, and this varies also in time frame. So this can occur at age 45 to 55 years of age. You have the perimenopause period, which is when you are going through the change, I guess we can say. And there you might see that the uterine cycle is less regular, similarly to what you might experience early on. You might have that first menstrual cycle, and then it might be a while before you get another. The uterine cycle does consist of three distinct phases. We start with the menstrual phase because this is an obvious starting point for the female, so it doesn't take any investigation to identify when the menstrual phase starts. And then you have second is the proliferative phase, and then secretory phase, and it's a cycle, remember, so it's going to go back to the beginning. The menstrual and proliferative phases are both occurring during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So we'll see that this is regulated by those hormones that are released there. And then the secretory phase should correlate to the luteal phase. So if the uterine cycle is a 28-day cycle, you're expecting the menstrual phase to be about 7 days, proliferative phase the next 7 days, so collectively that's 14 days, and then the secretory phase should last for the last 14 days. Now, the menstrual phase can vary, so it can last from 1 to 7 days. This is occurring with the decline in progesterone and estrogen that occurs when the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans. So if there's no pregnancy and implantation, then the corpus luteum is only present and releasing hormone for about 14 days, and then it stops. When you get that drop in progesterone and estrogen, that's going to cause constriction of those spiral arteries that are extending into that functional zone. We already know this. If you lose vascularization, if you lose blood flow, you're not getting oxygen, you're not getting nutrients, and you're not getting waste disposal. So we're going to see this will cause degeneration of that functional layer, and that is the material that is lost during menses. So all of the blood and degenerating tissue is going to leave through that vaginal canal. We will see that myometrium can contract to help with the expulsion of that material, and that can be detected or described as cramps. About 30 to 50 milliliters of blood is lost in that cycle. So it's not a whole lot. From there, we start to move into our proliferative phase. So this is that second 7 days. In this phase, you're expecting that functional zone basically to regenerate. So what we're going to see happening is at this point in the ovary, you have tertiary follicles that are enlarging and increasing their production of estrogen. As the estrogen levels increase, this is going to stimulate that proliferation of the functional zone. By day 14, you are expecting that functional zone to be several millimeters thick. You're also seeing a lot of glycogen-rich mucus being produced. So here in the proliferative phase at day 14, remember at the ovary, this is when ovulation should occur. We still need to get that secondary oocyte or immature ovum moving through the uterine tube before it makes its way to the uterus. So we still have some time here to do some additional changes to our functional zone. But we see pretty much it's set here at day 15. So we have a pretty nice, cozy, nutrient-rich, all that glycogen is there, environment for that developing embryo. The third phase is the secretory phase. So this is lasting for about 14 days. So at ovulation, remember, you get the production of the corpus luteum. I was thinking about micro here, I guess. I wrote corpus luteus after the Micrococcus luteus organism. Oopsie. So in the secretory phase, remember at day 14, after ovulation occurs, that follicle in the ovary becomes the corpus luteum, which is then going to increase its production of progesterone and estrogen. And so this is going to trigger and maintain that secretory phase. So progesterone is going to be really important in maintenance of the secretory phase. During this time, we see that the arteries are going to enlarge and spiral into that functional layer, and those uterine glands get larger and increase their amount of secretion. So now we have really this wonderful environment for our embryo to come in and implant into. If the embryo implants, you maintain that secretory phase until you have your viable pregnancy, right? And we'll see first the corpus luteum will help maintain that pregnancy, and then we'll see the placenta taking over and doing that job. But if you don't get implantation, remember the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans, which means we have a decrease again in our progesterone and estrogen, and so we're starting our cycle back over and we're ready for that menstrual phase. So let's try to put a few things together here. Okay, so if we start at the ovary with our corpus luteum becoming the corpus albicans, that's going to trigger a drop in progesterone and estrogen levels, which will trigger menses in the uterus. So we start losing that functional layer. When we lose our functional layer, or at that same time, we're going to see that our gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to be released. And so this is starting off the production of FSH, which is going to trigger enlarged activity enlargement and increased activity of those tertiary follicles in the ovary. As those follicles enlarge, we're going to increase our production of estrogen, which is going to initiate the proliferative phase in the uterus. So we're going to start building back up that functional lining. Ultimately, as we increase our estrogen, we're going to trigger a spike in LH from the adenohypophysis, which is going to trigger ovulation. At ovulation, remember that Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and so we get an increase in our progesterone and estrogen levels, which is going to trigger the secretory phase, which lasts for 14 days or longer if implantation occurs. After 14 days, if we don't have implantation, then that corpus luteum becomes called the corpus albicans, and progesterone and estrogen levels decline, triggering menses, yada, yada, yada. So we keep going with that. Remember, to be fertile, the ovarian and the uterine cycles have to be in sync so that when you are releasing that secondary oocyte or immature ovum at ovulation, then it's going to have that nice cozy environment in the uterus ready for possible implantation. Okay, that's it for now.